Good afternoon. I'm Wayne Ingram, and on behalf of Accenture, I'd like to welcome you all to Mars. If you walk outside, I think it does feel like another planet today. But Mars, what a great name for this Canadian success story. Because right here in the Discovery District, the best minds in science and technology are collaborating with business innovators to create Canada's next generation of growth companies. And thanks to the insights of Canadian thought leaders like Don Tapscott, who's an inaugural fellow right here at the Martin Prosperity Institute, Mars has earned a global reputation for creative and technological breakthroughs. The kinds of technologies that touch our lives every single day in some very small and in some very big ways. For example, in systems which make sure that that important Father's Day call actually makes it home to Dad across overloaded cell networks. Or with devices that keep things running smoothly and safely by remotely tracking and troubleshooting maintenance of the family car. And by digitally bringing together the best medical technologies and the best medical minds for life-saving diagnostics and treatment. Just a few years ago, these technologies would have been on people's wish list. Today, they are everyone's basic expectation. This puts a tremendous pressure on technology. We all want more, we all want better, we all want faster. Continuous exponential improvement is what people have come to expect from technology. But is that a valid expectation? Not only is it valid, I'd say it's necessary. Meeting that expectation creates tremendous momentum, real competitive drive, and the incredible potential for prosperity. I lead the Canadian technology and consulting practice at Accenture here in Canada, which means that I have the privilege of helping Canadian business and governments create their own tech future. From my perspective, it's clear that they do get it. They know that their future success depends on keeping pace with technology, and they look to us to get them there. Every year, Accenture collects and distills all of our research and our global client experience. Then we identify the trends CIOs must address to deliver the high performance that their stakeholders expect. This year's insights relate to context-based services, converging data architectures, industrialized IT services, and the ever-popular social-driven IT. Organizations that understand and strategically respond to these trends do position themselves for sustained success. How can I make these visionary recommendations to my clients with such confidence? Because I'm accessing the collective brain power of about 250,000 people, very smart people that work for Accenture around the globe. Sourcing the power of all that deep talent and client expertise has the multiplier effect of mass collaboration, which changes everything, as we know from Don Tapscott's incredibly influential 1997 bestseller, Wikinomics, How Mass Collaboration Changes Everything. It was true back then, and it's even more powerful force today. Don's views on social theory, innovation, media, and the economic impact of technology are sought out by business and government leaders around the world. And I'm proud to say that Don is a trusted advisor and a good friend to Accenture, not only here in his native country of Canada, but across the globe. Last year, he was named one of the world's most influential management thinkers by Thinkers 50, which perfectly aligns with his roles as chairman of Moxie Insight, a member of the World Economic Forum, and an adjunct professor at the Rotman School of Management, and he is also the author or co-author of 14 books. And Don is here to share insights from his latest book, written with Anthony D. Williams, Macrowikinomics, New Solutions for a Connected Planet. We all know that these days are solutions that we really need, and they're always very welcome. So please help me warmly welcome Don Tapscott. Don?
Thanks so much, Wayne. And I'd like to begin by thanking MaRS for hosting this and for Accenture for funding this initiative, including giving all of you the new edition of Macrowikinomics. You're some of the first people in the world to get it. It has a number of changes and a new forward, and I hope that you'll find it helpful. I'm going to talk today about one of the chapters. And it's the chapter that addresses a modest little problem of how do we fix the world's problems. And let's face it, we do have a broken world. But on the other hand, there are a new set of networks, of methods, of approaches, of models on how we can move forward in fixing the world and moving to a whole new age. And I'd like to begin with a story. Who here has seen the Kony 2012 video? Would you put up your hands? Okay. Who has not seen it? Anybody? Okay. So homework assignment number 1, when you're done here, is go watch the video. It's half an hour long, but you get a couple of minutes into it, and you'll be hooked. This video was weeks ago now. I watched it on a Monday night. On Friday night, when I looked at it again, Monday night, 12,000 people had seen it. On Friday night, over 100 million people had seen it. And the video seeks to, organized by a group called Invisible Children, seeks to make the Ugandan warlord Joseph Kony famous, in the sense of bringing forward to the world the crimes that he commits. So he's a bad guy. He's kidnapped 60,000 kids. He turns the boys into soldiers, a lot of the women, young women, girls, into sex slaves. If the kids don't cooperate, he kills their families. If the boys misbehave as soldiers, he cuts off their faces. So this movie exploded around the world like a prairie fire. And it's addressing a real issue, these warlords that exist throughout Africa. And the movie probably had a material impact. The US Congress, within days, had passed some legislation assigning some resources to help find Joseph Kony. And millions and millions of people gave money. And all around the world, people learned about some bad stuff that's going on in Africa. It was an initiative that was inspired, and it represents a new model of how to solve global problem solving. It's inspired, but is it legitimate? Who's it accountable to? Where does the money go? How do you get to affect the policy of the movement? Is it right that there should be more US troops in Uganda, as the movie argues? What happens when your leader has a meltdown? Has happened with the host of the video under the pressure of this massive thing. 2 weeks later, he had a psychotic breakdown. So the Kony 2012 movement showed both the promise and also the peril of these new models. But Bob Dylan, there's something going on here, and you don't know what it is. And this is now, I guess, my biggest project. It's being run out of the Martin Prosperity Institute upstairs. And we're bringing together all the world's leading thinkers to understand these new multi-stakeholder networks for global problem solving. Now, why do these things exist? Why should we care about them? And why are they important? Well, let me take you back a few hundred years. All around the world, we had an agrarian economy, and the means of production in the political system was called feudalism. And the state was organized largely around cities. We had city-states. And knowledge was concentrated in tiny oligopolies of the local nobility and the church, which extended beyond cities. And then along comes Johannes Gutenberg with his great invention, and knowledge started to become more broadly distributed. And the institutions of the city-state and agrarian feudal society started to appear to be stalled or frozen or even in atrophy or inappropriate. They seemed to have run their course. It didn't make sense for the church to be responsible for medicine when people had knowledge. And so we saw these big changes, the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther called the printing press God's highest act of grace. We saw the creation of parliamentary democracy. And eventually we saw national economies being formed, and they had borders around them. And they had the rule of law, the creation of states, nation states. And they had domestic institutions and armed forces and typically a language and some kind of institutions of governance and a currency and so on. And that's how the world is organized today, based on nation states. Except for a little detail, increasingly, we have a global economy. And this is largely being precipitated by another communications revolution. The internet, the digital revolution, mobility, the web, all this stuff that we talk about. But it's very different than the printing press. The printing press gave us access to the written word. The internet enables each of us to be a publisher. The printing press gave us access to recorded knowledge. The internet gives us access to the intelligence contained in the crania of other people on a global basis. So this is not an information age. It's an age of networking human intelligence. And it's an age where we have all this activity, economic, social, political. We have all these problems that are global, that extend beyond nation states. And increasingly, the nation state is the wrong size to fix these problems. So this was well understood many, many years ago. After the Second World War, 40-something countries, 42 countries got together in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and they hammered out a bunch of things. And among other things, they created the United Nations, try and prevent a war from happening again. But they also created the World Bank, and this led to the IMF and the WTO, and it led to eventually the G8 and the G20, and now, as we speak here, the Rio conference is happening around climate change, nation states coming together to try and solve global problems. The trouble is they're having a tough time. Now, why are they having a tough time? Are these problems just too hard to solve? Or is there something structurally wrong in the world with the way that we go about solving problems? So let me give you a super controversial example that's happening right now. In Rio plus 20, today, Canada got called the dirty old man of climate change. Richard Branson stood up on the floor, interrupted the proceedings, singled out Canada as a big obstacle in solving the environmental problem in the world. Greenpeace got up and pointed to Canada. So Canada has a nation, we are a nation state, and we have representatives that we have elected, and they go off and they present our point of view at an environmental conference. Trouble is this truly representative of Canadians, or are we missing some subtle alternative points of view that might exist in the country? You know, well, we have a government that is a majority government, a real strong majority, and it's taken power, and that's a good model. It won with 40% of the vote. 60% of the electorate voted, so 4 times 6 is 24. 24% of voting Canadians elected a government that is putting forward our point of view at this big global conference. But it's missing, and that's a legitimate point of view. Clearly, it represents at least probably 24% of the country. But below that are all kinds of other alternative points of view, other ways of thinking about this issue that our state-to-state model doesn't fully embrace. Meanwhile, on the issue of climate change, I estimate there are tens of millions of people who are just doing stuff on this topic. And they're not what Malcolm Gladwell calls slacktivists. You know, you go like on Facebook and you think you're changing the world. Well, actually, no, they're doing stuff. They're right in Toronto, architects collaborating all around the world with other architects, trying to figure out how to build sustainable buildings or how to retrofit old buildings. There are kids in schoolyards with projects to reduce the carbon in their community. This is the first time when the world is being mobilized and we're all on the same side. Now, there are differences, but we're roughly all on the same side. We understand that this is a big problem. It's got something to do with human behavior. The world has been mobilized before. That led to Bretton Woods. It's called the Second World War, the First World War. But in those mobilizations, we were on very different sides. Well, today, we're kind of all on the same side. So it turns out the killer app for the internet may be saving the planet, literally. So these new multi-stakeholder networks around the environment are becoming material. They're resulting in real change, real improvement. Now, what's a multi-stakeholder network? Well, it involves some combination of the 4 pillars of society. Now, you probably, if any of you have studied political science, you know about the 3 pillars. But I'm going to argue to you that there are 4. There's the state. Those are all the states that got together at Bretton Woods. Then there's the private sector. Well, there were no companies at Bretton Woods because companies were viewed as having a very limited role in the society. We look around today. Companies, I mean, Accenture is a great example, being really influential and very active in all kinds of things. They describe it the multipolar world. I'll just pose a question to you. What's the most important institution in the world today defending human rights in China? What would you say it is? Sorry? Google. I think that's a real legitimate answer. I mean, you might say, well, Hillary Clinton in the US State Department, and they're doing their bit. But Google is taking on the government of China. Did you see the report that Google released yesterday about the thousands and thousands of requests that they have got to censor stuff, including from the Canadian government? And this is full transparency. They tell you whether or not they took action on it or not. So the private sector is now a pillar of society. It has responsibilities for innovation and creating goods and services and so on, but it now is playing a broader role. Then we have the civil society. This is a little group called Taking It Global. It's based in Toronto. Any of you know that? Yeah, this is a few 100,000 young people on a social network of kids who want to change the world. Extraordinary organization. There were no civil society organizations at Bretton Woods because there weren't any. There were a few dozen global civil society organizations in 1945. Today, the civil society is what? Like 10% of the Canadian economy? It's a big and growing concern. You know what I'm talking about. Not-for-profits, NGOs, unions, organizations, associations. And the final one is you. You are now, or can be, a pillar of society. So 2 young people in Boston were pillars of society during the Haitian earthquake. There was a 7-year-old girl buried under the rubble in a supermarket that had collapsed. She was dying, and she managed to get out a little text message in Creole, and these 2 kids, young people in Boston, picked it up on the Ushahidi network, translated it into English and French, and informed the authorities. She was geolocated. They went in, they saved her life. Haiti wasn't a national problem for Haiti. It was a global problem, and 2 young people in Boston were pillars of society in helping to solve a global problem. So this is a big change. It's a change to one of 16 institutions. These pretty much correspond to the chapters of macroeconomics that you have in your hand. And I'm happy to talk about any of the other 15 today, but I'm focusing on this one. It's the nation state and global problem solving. But it's an example of how the industrial age has finally come to an end, and our industrial age models of doing just about everything are stalled. They're frozen. They're in atrophy, and they're failing. And we need to rebuild all of these institutions around a new set of principles and around the internet. Now, why is this happening? Well, to begin, we do have this technology revolution. And it's not just there are, 1 billion people, close to that on Facebook now. How many on Twitter? It's got 350 million or something like that. But it's that social networking is becoming social production. We not only talk about stuff with this new media, we actually do things. This is not about hooking up online. It's a new means of production that's changing the deep structure and architecture of every institution in society. And collaboration that can occur on an astronomical scale is now coming into the modus operandi of all of our institutions, and it can address this problem for us. Secondly, we have a new generation. There's not just a tech revolution, there's a demographic revolution. The so-called, as I described them years ago, the net generation, the first generation to come of age in this digital age. This is a demographic tsunami around the world. This is the world map according to surface area. It's a little program, open source program called World Mapper, and you can plug different data sets into the map. So this is one that's just available. And I plugged a bunch of data sets into every country in the world. This is the world map according to surface area. This is the world map according to populations age 15 to 30. So Western Europe is actually pretty small. Japan, small. Korea is relatively small compared to the economy. Look at Africa and Asia. Even Latin America, there are a lot of young people. Canada's not too bad. We had the baby boom. We had the baby boom, and then the birth rate dropped off for a period of 12 years called the baby bust. And then we had the echo of the boom. And there's 8 million of them in Canada. There's only 7.8 million baby boomers. I was speaking in Italy recently, and I said, who here has children under the age of 33? I was in Brazil last week, and I asked that, and like almost every hand in the room went up. In Italy, like a few little hands went up. I was tempted to say, you know what? Why don't we just end this right now? Go home, have a glass of wine, light a candle, put on some music, make some babies. Because we need young people. But we need young people for more reasons than just to have young people around. We need the net generation. This is the first generation of digital natives. I'm a digital immigrant. I had to learn the language. And there's no more powerful force to change the world than this new generation, because they think differently. They're collaborators. They're much more open. They're innovators. They want speed, and they understand that the world is broken and that they are disproportionately recipients of the mess that the world's in. I mean, we had the jobless recovery, a term that I detest. I mean, there is no recovery unless it's inclusive, right? And what is it, 14, 15% youth unemployment in Canada, and then you add another 10% of terrible underemployment where people with degrees are working in Starbucks and so on. This is a formula for a big problem. But it's also a formula for a lot of change, and we're seeing that. Now, you put those two together and you get a social revolution, self-organization. I have told this story before in Toronto. I want to make sure that you haven't all heard it. Who's heard this story about Barack Obama and the MIBO? Okay, nobody. That's unbelievable. I keep thinking everything I've said someone has heard before, but so this is self-organization is the topic. And that's what's behind these movements and these networks. It was about 5 years ago, somebody sent me an email saying, you know this guy, Obama, he's trying to get the nomination for the Democratic Party, the senator in Illinois. He thinks your book, Wikinomics, is the key to winning the presidency and the key to transforming America. Go to myBarackObama.com. So I went there. There's my book on the screen. And it's like, we believe in guided self-organization, dynamic partnering, transparency, use of the internet every way possible, and the book by Don Tapscott and Anthony Williams, and he's saying, I'm asking you to believe not just in my ability to bring about real change in Washington, I'm asking you to believe in yours. And I looked at this thing and, well, my first reaction was, I am the man. But not so fast, Don, because it turns out I'm not the man. Because I started looking around. There's a Wikinomics community. There's also a single moms for daycare for Obama community. And there was a young firefighters for Obama community. He created a platform whereby 35,000 communities self-organized, and that's what brought him to power. Now, did he change the way you govern? Or do we still have the industrial age model? You vote, I rule. And most bizarrely, you may have seen, I wrote a piece in the Globe last week, and I've been writing about this. He's reverted back. He's not doing this anymore. Now that he's in power, he wants to have a controlled campaign. And rather than harnessing self-organization, he's gone from, yes, we can, to we know you, big data. Every day, I get a highly personalized email from Obama, it seems to know a lot about me, asking me for money. But if I want to go and create a community, forget it. You can't do that. So setting that aside, I think that's a big mistake. But anyway, self-organization has been around throughout human history. There was no central committee of the English language that said this will be called a class. It just kind of happened. But what used to take place over millennia can now happen very, very fast. And that's at the heart of these new movements as well. Now, this is leading to another powerful new force, which is called transparency. And that's at the heart of these new networks, too. I was with the State Department recently, and I gave a briefing there to the management. And we talked about a lot of tough things, but one of them was WikiLeaks. And my view is that, sure, I mean, government employees shouldn't be violating their confidentiality agreements, and for sure, it's not in the interest of the public for all diplomacy to be held in the open. But WikiLeaks is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a new force, actually an old force with some new power, and it's called transparency. And this is a force that the State Department and every institution ought to feel really good about. Because among other things, sunlight is the best disinfectant for this infected world that we have. People at their fingertips everywhere have these powerful tools for finding what's going on, organizing collective responses. And corporations, governments, and other institutions everywhere are becoming naked. It used to be if there was some big global meeting on the environment, decades ago, nobody would have a real time, be able to watch it live and see, what people are actually saying about your country from the floor, but now you can. So these institutions are becoming naked, and when you become naked, there are a number of corollaries. I mean, one is that fitness is no longer optional. If you're going to be naked, you better get buff. And that means that you need to have good value, because value is evidence like never before. But you also need to have values. You need to have the values of integrity as part of your bones. This is a book that another Torontonian, David Tickle, and I wrote a decade ago. It was a very good book that nobody read. It was off by about 10 years, almost to the month. And now transparency, of course, is this huge force to the fact that TED Global next week in Edinburgh, the whole theme is openness. So buff, our institutions, our governments, our countries, our corporations increasingly need to have integrity as part of their bones. That's about being honest, it's about being considerate of the interests of others, and it's about abiding by your commitments and being accountable. And along with transparency, this is the foundation of trust. What is trust? You have business relationships. I mean, what is trust? I asked myself that about 10 years ago when I was working on this book. A month later, I hadn't written a word, but I read everything I could find out about trust. I think I can say what trust is now in a sentence. Trust is the expectation, trust in business and then in government and so on, is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity and transparency. That they'll be honest, they're not going to try and rip you off, that they'll be considerate of your interests, you're negotiating something, they actually care about you, that they'll abide by their commitments and be accountable, and that they'll be open. The expression, what are they hiding, shows a relationship between transparency and trust. So this is leading to, I've called it the integrity imperative, that increasingly companies, governments, institutions everywhere are naked and they're having to get buff. And this is a very powerful force for change. And the final one is an economic revolution. These big governments that we have that came out of the industrial age, big governments, bureaucracies, came out of the same period in history as the old industrial age corporation. And it was called vertically integrated. It did everything from soup to nuts. And some of you may be economists. There was this very famous economist. He wasn't famous at the time. His name was Ronald Coase, 75 years ago, wrote a paper where he asked a deceptively simple question. He said, why does the firm exist? If Adam Smith is right, and the open market's the best mechanism to determine how goods and resources and people and information are allocated, why isn't everybody an independent contractor at every step along the way in production? Why do we have companies? Why do you work for firms? And he said the answer is, and he won a Nobel Prize for saying this, the answer is transaction costs. Now, he defined that very broadly. He meant the cost of collaboration. He said the cost of search, this is 75 years ago, the cost of search in an open market, of finding all the right people and information and so on to do things, totally prohibitive. So we bring that inside the boundaries of a corporation where we have things like filing cabinets to find information and org charts to find people and so on. Well, the big industrialists understood this. And the model of government was based on this model. They were vertically integrated industrial age bureaucracies. And the term bureaucracy 80 years ago was this really hot management term. We needed bureaucracy to avoid patronage and graft and corruption and protect the public dollar and so on. But now, over time, and thinking about Wayne and going in and redoing the systems of a government, we've layered on all this technology and business processes, and now we have all this stuff that codes the organization of today into the structures and technology of the past. And it's a big challenge for us. Well, in the private sector, boundaries are becoming more porous. And governments, as well as private companies, can now embrace a whole new modus operandi. Governments used to say, we're a government, we're a nation state, we take tax dollars from citizens, and then we have these people inside our boundaries, and they create what's called services, and we deliver them back. We hope you enjoy your services. We also do another big thing. We create laws. And so I define services broadly. It includes safety and protecting people and defense and so on. Well, now we can start to think about government very differently. Sure, it'll continue to do that, but it can also be a platform upon which others can self-organize to create value. So governments, just by releasing raw data, can enable a new division of labor in society about how we create what we used to call services or public value. And this is a profound and historic change to the architecture of what is a government. Now, this is happening in cities, Canada, provinces, and at the national level. And around the world, the same thing can occur when it comes to our models of global problem solving. They don't need to be based on traditional vertically integrated states. And another big thing that's underway is we've got a lot of rich people who've gone and made $30 billion and who say, my big goal is to have it all given away before I'm dead. And that's a big change as well. I mean, Rockefeller and these people were philanthropists, but that's nothing compared to, the new philanthrocapitalism that kind of exists today. And there's a big change, and a lot of you know about this, social innovation, social entrepreneurship. I know people involved in fundraising for not-for-profits and NGOs and civil society organizations don't call people donors anymore. They call them investors. They want to take your money, but they're going to be accountable. They're going to give you feedback. They're going to engage you in all kinds of new ways. So you put all that together, and you've got a very different scene today. A whole bunch of drivers that are enabling us to think very differently about how to solve problems. And there's a final one. We have a global economic crisis. And these, you look around the world and you see all these things, a bunch of students angry in Quebec, and a double-dip recession in the UK, and a sovereign debt crisis throughout all of Europe that's messing up the whole stock market, and a so-called jobless recovery in the United States, and youth unemployment in Spain of 45%. These are not random, unconnected things. They're all related inexorably to this fundamental fact that the industrial age has finally run out of gas. And we have a whole bunch of institutions and ways of doing things that took us forward in human history to a certain point and can no longer take us forward. So we have a burning platform for change. Okay, you know the burning platform analogy, right? You're on an oil rig and it's on fire. the costs of staying where you are at a certain point become greater than the costs of doing something radically different, moving to something radically new. So take something like government, reinventing government. Al Gore was talking about this 20 years ago. I wrote a book in 1995 called The Digital Economy. I had a whole section on reinventing government. Nothing really happened, but now we have a burning platform. We have to reinvent government. So let me just pull this together and talk to you specifically about what are these multi-stakeholder networks. First of all, they have some combination of the 4 pillars of society. They're beyond one state. And I'm being quite rigorous about this in this research project. I'd love to talk about some of these networks within Tunisia, for example, but unless they extend beyond a state, they're outside the boundaries of our work. And they seek to improve the state of the world, helping solve a problem, develop new policies, solutions, influence, Kony, states and institutions, or otherwise contribute to economic and social development, human rights, sustainability, democracy, global cooperation, and global governance. Now you could say, well, does Al-Qaeda, which is a network that involves a bunch of different stakeholders that is highly decentralized and collaborates in this way, would that fall into the category of my research? And I'm saying no, they don't. Because I think for most reasonable people, if you thought about Al-Qaeda, this is not really what they're attempting to achieve. So finally, these networks are possible now, or at least their explosive scale and capability and speed are possible because of a new technology platform. The internet, the web, mobility, and so on. I mean, you could have had a video like Kony 30 years ago, but it wouldn't have been watched by 100 million people. So what I want to do is share with, and I'd be really grateful for any feedback too, because I haven't published this yet. I'm writing for this big research project we're doing, I'm writing the first white paper that tries to develop a taxonomy to describe these things. And it's so bizarre. Here these things are, involving tens of millions of people all around the world. They're material. They're having a huge impact. There's no real literature about them. There's no case study database. There's no language to talk about them. And there's no taxonomy to describe them. So I'm going to, you heard it here first, give you a taxonomy to think about these networks and what makes them tick. From what I can figure, there are 9 types. The first is knowledge networks. Now, the primary function of these networks is just to develop knowledge. In the past, we had these networks. They were called global research networks. So all of the people researching some kind of engineering field might get together and collaborate globally. But now, there's a step function up from that with the internet. Back in the day, they'd all do their little research, and they'd come together every 2 years, and they'd present papers, and those would be published 2 years later. Well, this is now all a real time. And there are all kinds of knowledge networks. Where's Selena? Can I have my glasses? I think I left them there in my bag or something. But an example of a knowledge network would be this project, the Martin Prosperity Institute project. It's a global network. We're collaborating with all kinds of people. And what we're trying to do, basically, is to develop knowledge. What other knowledge networks could you think of? Well, Wikipedia would be an example, wouldn't it? This is a multi-stakeholder network that's global, that's seeking to solve a problem. Thank you so much. Which is the lack of the penetration of knowledge available to different people. But I would add the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the Global Network for Women and Children's Health. TED would be one. Habitat Jam. This is Habitat for Humanity, which is a state-based institution. But they created a 3-day multi-stakeholder network where they had a 3-day conversation of the world. Well, 50,000 people participated from all around the world in a jam to talk about how to solve the housing problem. So that's a first kind of network. They're not advocating like Kony. They're just trying to develop knowledge. Okay, number two, we call them policy networks. So sometimes networks create a government policy, even though they may consist of non-governmental players. And they may or may not be created or even encouraged by formal governments or government institutions. And they may be supporting policy development, or they may actually create a policy where a government has assigned policy creation to a network or created an alternative for policy. Now, a real local basis here, not global. The Ontario government wanted to create a policy for social innovation, and it took a risk. It said, we're going to create a wiki. I don't know if any of you participated in that thing. Some of you did. And it was an extraordinary thing. It came up with a document I saw. It was an amazing piece of work. Now, I don't know if the government has adopted it. Oh, yeah, right, they don't have a budget. Or do we have a budget? But anyway, but that was an interesting sort of local innovation. Well, now this can occur on a global scale. So you've got this thing called the Internet Governance Forum, for example. The purpose, it's not state-based. It's a multi-stakeholder network that's actually developing policy. But another example would be the International Competition Network. And there are dozens or hundreds, in some cases, thousands of examples for each of these categories. Then we have advocacy networks, like Kony. They're seeking to change the agenda-setting networks, or to change the policies of governments, but they also can seek to change the policy of corporations or other institutions. And examples would be Vaz.org, which is an incredible organization, Keep a Child Alive, Conscious Capitalism. They advocate towards corporations, not towards governments. And if you go to worldadvocacy.com, you'll see, I couldn't count them all, look like a couple of thousand of these advocacy, multi-stakeholder advocacy networks that exist. Then we have, this is incredible, operational delivery networks. These are networks that are not just talking about things, they're not just creating knowledge, they're not just advocating, they're not developing policy, they're actually fixing things, doing things in the world to solve global problems. So they deliver the change that they seek, supplementing or even bypassing the efforts of traditional institutions. So crisis commons would be a good example. That there's a crisis somewhere in the world, and all these people mobilize through crisis commons to fix it, to get sandbags along a river, or to dig people out of rubble, or to solve any kind of crisis, pretty much, that exists. But others would be Kiva. Do you know Kiva? Yeah, many heads nodding here. I mean, for some reason, the World Bank can't get a $70 pump to a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, where if he stands on the pump, he can irrigate, or she can irrigate a field and support a village. So Kiva said, we'll do it. And they basically microfinance this stuff through little donations. I think they're over $400 million now that they've raised, and this money goes out. And Kiva's, in some ways, trying to create a platform for all kinds of other organizations to do stuff. How are we doing here? Okay, we're almost done. But other examples would be 350.org, the Standby Task Force, Digital Democracy. It's a little group that, it's very small, but they want to go into situations where there are human rights violations on the ground, in the jungle, and use technology and the internet to help expose things and to actually help people get democratic institutions. But you could say, I think a precursor would be the Red Cross, and certainly the Red Cross of today. World Wildlife Fund, even the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Global Health Program, not the foundation as a whole, but the Global Health Program, would be a multi-stakeholder network. Medicines for Malaria, Venture, etc. They're actually doing things. Now, next class is networks that try and convene really important and influential people to get them to come together in the hope that good things will happen. And an example of that would be the World Economic Forum, that, you know, the 10,000 people who run the world interact somehow with the World Economic Forum. 3,000 of them come together every year in Davos. And the idea is that if you get them together, some good things will happen. And of course, the World Economic Forum does a lot more than convening now. And I should have said that all of these networks, or many of them, cross over into another category. But what I'm trying to do is develop a framework that where you can say any given network primarily fits in this category, even though they may be doing other things. I don't know if I'm successful at that, but I think I might be. But other examples of convening networks would be the Clinton Global Initiative, the Global Water Partnership, and so on. Watchdog networks are like the word says. They're watchdogs. They're scrutinizing institutions and exposing just what they do. They're not really advocating. They're not developing a policy. They're just seeing if you live up to what you say you're supposed to be doing. So Human Rights Watch would be a great example of that. They have researchers all around the world that are on the ground collecting real information about violations of human rights, and they're publishing this and telling the world. But the Environmental Working Group, I would say even Amnesty International today, would fall in this category. This is a whole new one. I call it platforms. These are networks that aren't actually fighting for human rights or fighting to save the 3 million people dying every year from cooking fires, or they're not trying to stop conflict, or they're not trying to reduce carbon or something like that. They're creating a platform for others to do that. And Ushahidi be a great example now. It was created by this young woman, Ori Okolo, a lawyer in Uganda during the 2007 elections. After the elections, there was all this violence that occurred, and there's no sophisticated media in Kenya to report on all this. So she created a network whereby people could report on what's going on, and this actually was material in leading to an end to the violence. But now Ushahidi has become a platform for others to self-organize, including well, it's been used in all kinds of ways by these two youngsters saving a life in Haiti. It was used by the authorities, the police and other authorities in Washington, D.C. during Snowmageddon, where the D.C., they had like 3 feet of snow happened one day. And the BBC has even used it during the whole crisis during the volcano that happened in Iceland. Number 8 is political action networks. I think this is a category. These are networks, they're not trying to influence anybody. They're actually trying to bring about a regime change or change of government. So a good example would be Move On. It was created during the period of George W. Bush. They weren't trying to develop a policy or something. They were trying to get rid of the Bush government so that there could be a new government come in. And now they're supportive of Obama, so they're trying to defend a government. I think that's fair. They might say not. But these things are now kind of going global. Will we start to see these networks, for example, across Northern Africa and the Arab world, of people, networks of stakeholders all across a region that seek to create a certain kind of government, like a democratic and secular government? Well, there's all kinds of evidence that those are getting started. And the final one is one of the most interesting to me, governance networks. These are networks that have somehow actually achieved or been granted the responsibility to govern the world on a certain topic. They're different from government networks described by Anne-Marie Slaughter. She's at Princeton, wrote the book A New World Order, which is the classic book about networks of government people, not at the head of state level, but down here, that are doing extraordinary things. But that's outside the boundaries of what I'm looking at. These are networks that involve multi-stakeholders. They may be initiated by some governments, but they have an actual governance responsibility. So ICANN would be a great example of that. That the governance of the internet is not a state-based global institution. It's done by this multi-stakeholder network. This is the International Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. But you've got the International Organization of Securities Commissions, would be another example. And now we're about to see a huge showdown in the world this fall between, on the one hand, ICANN and the Internet Society and the Internet Governance Forum and other multi-stakeholder networks versus the state-based International Telecommunications Union, where you've got people, heads of state, like Vladimir Putin, saying this internet, it's got some good stuff, but mainly we need to control it and prevent people from spreading lies on the internet and so on. So this is a showdown that all of you should care very much about. And for sure we'll be looking at what our country has to say in this showdown. But I'm kind of betting on the people, and not the people organized in states. I'm betting on the people that are self-organizing, because the train has left the station. The cat is out of the bag. The horse has left the, help me out here. The toothpaste is out of the tube. I mean, we're not going back to some previous period in human history. Now let me just end, and this is going to leave us almost 40 minutes to have a conversation about some of the tough issues about these things. How do they establish, and I don't know the answers. Any of you would like to work on this, of course, I'd be thrilled to get some support. And there are a number of the people in the project that are in the room. How do we achieve legitimacy? How do you get accountability for these things? Who are they accountable to? And what is the process by which we can say they did abide by their commitments? How about representation? You know, you can say what you like about the United Nations being not very productive in all kinds of areas, but at least there's a process whereby there are certain accountabilities and certain kinds of representation. What's the relationship of these things to existing institutions? Don't get me wrong, the nation state's not going to go away, not in my lifetime. And the nation state is still kind of important because that's where we organize power. State power, it's called. State power has stuff like the ability to tax and raise money, armed force, you know, the ability to mobilize massive human capital to do certain things. And these will continue to be important for the foreseeable future. And in a lot of cases, these networks are not replacing what these state-based institutions do. They're trying to work with them or encourage them to do something. So I'll just give you a little example. Take the issue of legitimacy. Here's a little straw person attempt to try and solve this problem. Okay? How do we achieve legitimacy in a multi-stakeholder network for solving global problems? Number one, you need a clear definition of the mission so that everybody knows what you're trying to do. Number two is you need to have some kind of structure or process to ensure that that network operates within the mission. It's one thing to have a mission. You know, you need a way to ensure that you work in aid of that mission. Then you need some ways of measuring yourself and your results. Transparency is totally key. You'll read in the book another whole other chapter around something Anthony and I call the citizen regulator. That you know, increasingly it's getting tough to regulate all the things that ought to be regulated. I mean, the Consumer Electronics Show alone had 22,000 new products. What should we do? Go hire another 100 regulators to go be checking for lead and toxic chemicals and effect on radiation and all? No, we need to use these little devices as ways that we can all regulate. And you know, for $20, you can get something that sticks in your iPhone that can test the environment, or that can scan a toy to see if there's lead in the toy and so on. So there's a powerful new mass force here that can regulate, if you like. So if you're open, you have transparency, that's good. Then you need a clear representation process for the decision making. So if Kony comes up with a decision saying we should have more troops in Uganda, there's a process whereby you can somehow get involved and you can say, no, actually, we don't think that's a good idea. There are other ways to deal with the problem of these African warlords. And finally, compensation and rewards and money is obviously a big issue. And the World Economic Forum, for example, Klaus Schwab there has told me that the principle of the WEF is, he's been the leader of the WEF forever. He basically founded it. But at some point, he will be replaced. And when he is, his successor will not be able to make more than a senior government official in Switzerland. Even though this is a massive organization that raises a ton of money, he's paid the same level as a bureaucrat, which is what somebody on Wall Street makes in a good week, probably. So that might be a way of attacking the problem of legitimacy. I don't know. I'm out of time, so I'll just tell you what I was going to say rather than saying it. What should state-based institutions, some of you are here from global institutions, do about this? I was just yesterday, I was in the World Bank and also in the Pentagon talking about this stuff. Well, first of all, look for new models to engage these networks. So Habitat for Humanity, state-based institution, launched Habitat Jam to engage people all around the world who care about the housing problem. That rather than viewing these things as a threat or something that is irrelevant to you, you view it as a huge pool of labor and a resource. Kind of like IBM viewed Linux as a huge pool of labor rather than as a threat to its core operating system platform. Now, Obama, to his credit, has done some good stuff. The Open Innovation Portal within the United States, where people from the US but other countries can get involved in challenges. I was involved, Sean Wise is here. We were involved in doing a thing called the ITS Challenge, the Intelligent Transportation System Challenge, where we, IBM gave a prize of, I think it was like $50,000 or something like that. And the challenge was, find us the best solution to the transportation problem in the United States. It's a US thing. And 122 companies responded. There was this huge discussion. We had a crowd that helped evaluate the companies, ask them questions, vote, whittle them down to 20, to 10, to 3, and they selected a winner announced at the ITS Congress. Now, we were in a state, but we're a little two-bit operation. But if we could do something like that, imagine what you could do if you had state power. So really interesting things, like the federal government has made a good move, I think. They've set aside a big pot of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're trying to figure out how to help entrepreneurs. Well, the way to do that would be to engage the population. And I don't think I'm telling stories out of school, where I was at a meeting earlier today where they were engaging a whole bunch of people to try and understand what might be the right thing to do. And they could certainly take that beyond, have a 3-day discussion of all Canadians about this, and they could do a whole series of challenges like the ITS Challenge to encourage these networks to happen. The BC government did it around the apps for climate change, where they said, we're going to release all of our data about carbon, and we challenge the software industry to come up with some apps that will use this data. The winner, you can take your little mobile device, and you see the carbon being emitted real time by your company. You turn off the lights on one floor of your office building, you see the carbon go down. This is really helpful. Real-time feedback about carbon, so you can better understand if things you're doing are actually making an impact. The prize there was $25,000. They got 22 amazing apps. If they'd gone out with an RFP to develop all these apps, it would have cost millions and millions of dollars. And they generated all kinds of great economic activity, an example of a government reaching out to engage citizens and these networks rather than to view them as a threat. So in the world, I think we are moving to a second era of democracy. And the first era, we created these representative institutions around nation states, within a nation state and between them. And that was good. I mean, it was a lot better than what existed before. But there was a weak public mandate, and citizens are pretty much inert. Now we can move to a second era that's based, we still have representative institutions and state-based institutions, but we have a culture of public deliberation and a world of active citizenship and of participation. This is a time of great promise. It's also a time of great peril. The stakes are high. And I'm pretty convinced we're moving into a period where there's going to be significant social unrest. And we're already starting to see it. I mean, it started with the Arab Spring. And these things were caused by social media. They were caused by injustice, by oppression. They weren't created by social media. They were created by a new generation who wanted hope and who didn't want to be treated as subjects. But the social media was key. That just like as it drops transaction costs in business and in government, it drops the costs of dissent and of rebellion and even of insurrection. Now again, I'd be happy to talk about the dark side of all this. Up until 2 years ago, all revolutions in human history had a leadership, and when the old regime fell, the leadership took power. These wiki revolutions happen so fast, they create a vacuum, and politics abhors a vacuum. And unsavory forces come in and try and fill the vacuum, and this is, of course, what's happening in Egypt today. The biggest threat being the old regime, but also the other threat being extremists who would oppose an open, democratic, and secular society. But you look around the world and, you know, it's easy to write off Occupy as a bunch of hippie, earth-shoe, mama, anarchist, radical losers. And I suppose there are some of those. But this is the tip of the iceberg of a growing feeling in the world that we have some big problems and they're not getting fixed. And the world is becoming more and more unfair. And the youth are the main recipients of this unfairness. And sure, you can write off the London rioters as a bunch of criminals, and there were some. But this is the tip of the iceberg of something even bigger. And let me end by provoking you. I don't think the Quebec student upsurge, the biggest demonstrations in Canadian history, were about tuition. You know, a bunch of loser kids. Come on, tuition's twice the cost in Ontario. I mean, why don't they suck it up and pay for their education? No. That was just a little fuse for a bigger feeling that young people are moving into a world without a lot of promise. You know, we told young people, you work hard, you stay out of trouble, you get a degree, you can have a prosperous life. All around the world, young people are starting to wonder, is that true? I think we may be in the early days of a global youth radicalization that'll make the 1960s look like kids' stuff. So that's why I'm very passionate about this topic. We have big problems in the world. Our existing institutions can't seem to fix them. We need a whole new paradigm. A paradigm is a mental model, and it puts boundaries around what we think, and it constrains our actions, and paradigms are often based on assumptions that are so strong that we don't know that they're there. You know, the Earth is at the center of the universe. Remember, the big problem in the world is communism. Remember that one? The purpose of computing is to automate existing business processes with the goal of reducing headcount. These are all paradigms, and something comes along in art, science, culture, whatever, that causes a shift. We can govern our world through states cooperating. Well, that's turning out to be not true. And so somehow we need to find the leadership to bring about a new paradigm. I'm glad, this was great, this thing was sold out, and I get great encouragement from that you've self-selected in some ways as people who care about this topic and perhaps can deepen your commitment to be a leader to bring about this change. This is a project we're doing. These are some of the great people that we've got. I mentioned Anne-Marie Slaughter. Niger Woods is the brand new School of Government at Oxford University, and she's a partner at Richard Florida, who's in the office next to me upstairs. We got the U.S. State Department involved, Mozilla Foundation, Anthony, of course, my collaborator over many years. Sean Wise sitting here in the room. These are just a little snippet of some of the faculty on this thing, and we're looking for researchers. We don't have any money yet, so if any of you have money, we would gladly accept that. It's a not-for-profit project. But if you're interested in helping out, please see me or Selena or one of the Accenture people. So, door number 1 and door number 2. I think we're headed into the wrong door. We can take a different route if we will it. So, thank you.